So we've covered like the low, what are called the low and the middle scopes. So today we're covering the great scope, the Mahayana, great vehicle form of Buddhism. And I should say, like, it may seem funny because our center is part of the foundation for the preservation of the Mahayana tradition, right? And so, and there was a great emphasis on compassion, actually. But in this series of classes presenting the path, I kind of spent more time on the low and middle scopes. I just want to explain that the reason why I did that is because that's the levels most of us are at, so I'll spend more time on. But we'll spend lots of time on bodhicitta in other modules, but I want to at least cover it. So there are two methods, cover some of that today. So there are two methods in two traditions and two methods for generating bodhicitta. One is called the 7-point cause and effect method. That method involves, if you hear Tibetans, like always in Tibetan, not always, often in Tibetan prayers, it says all mother sentient beings. So that one is the contemplation of the kindness of the mother. We're going to cover that one another time. I'm not going to cover it today. But it's a beautiful meditation, so we will cover it. But today I'm going to cover the other method, discuss the other method for generating bodhicitta, which is called equalizing and then exchanging self with others. So this method was is part of the stages of the path tradition. It was brought to, various masters brought it to Tibet, but the most kind of main lineage that was brought to Tibet was by Atisha, who taught the 7-point mind training. Actually, students wrote the 7-point mind training, but he taught it. But it's okay. So this method, equalizing and exchanging self for others, is actually of the two, it's said to be for more intelligent disciples. So I'm not sure. Maybe I should cover the other one. I'm not sure for myself. But we'll start with this one. So, okay. So actually, what we just did was the first contemplation in that equanimity or equalizing self with others. So what you would do, I just want to be clear on that one before I go on to the next steps. What you would do is you would, like what we just did, right, where you're contemplating everybody wants to be happy, everybody wants, you wouldn't just do that once, you would do it over and over and over until it started to affect how you felt. Right? And so you started to actually feel a sense, when you saw other people, that you would start to step out of your own subjectivity and empathize more, right? And recognize, wow, everybody really is the same. So even when somebody's being difficult towards you, right? Just from this first contemplation, you would start to get a sense of, well, they're being difficult because they want to be happy, right? And they think I'm annoying because I'm getting in the way of their happiness, right? Otherwise they wouldn't be being difficult to me. And so, like on the one hand, yes, there's still my subjectivity that thinks they're annoying, but then there's their subjectivity that thinks I'm annoying, and neither one is more important than the other, right? And so what you do, just from that one contemplation, this is not yet bodhicitta, it's a preliminary, but just from that you start to get less annoying. Right? You start to annoy others less because you start to recognize, well, they have the right to happiness too, right? Ordinarily, like part of what makes us annoying is that we prioritize our own happiness over the other person's. Nobody likes that, right? Because then we, in our seeking our own thing, we block that. And there's one further part of that contemplation that's sometimes done. But the part we did was, was how you would do it at the beginning. But then eventually, as you keep going, there's a contemplation where you take that one more step in that one, where you actually think, okay, so everybody's equal, precisely equal in wanting happiness and not wanting suffering, right? So once you get used to that experientially, in a sort of feeling level, then you would start to contemplate also, just again, this is all logical. The Dalai Lama often says, this is just logic, it's simple, right? That I'm just one, others are numberless. And so, to prioritize, if we're all equal in the sense of wanting happiness and not wanting suffering, part of this first contemplation on equalizing would be to say, well, to prioritize my own happiness over that of countless others is silly, right? That's not logical. It's a kind of silly way to live. It's a silly way to think. It's an old habit, but that doesn't make it right, And so you would start to say, and actually, Lama Zopa Rinpoche often emphasizes this point when he teaches, and I like that he often says this. He says, actually, this is the way to make decisions in your life. If you get good at this contemplation, then you can say, whenever you ask, what should I do? Well, what will bring the most happiness to the largest number of people? That's what I should do. It's a very logical way to make decisions, right? ordinarily we make the decision, what do I think will make me the most happy? Which often doesn't, and part of what we're going to get to is which doesn't work, right? If you think what's going to make me the most happy regardless of others, and then you do that, right, then others get mad at you or get frustrated with you or you have problems with them and it doesn't work anyway. So in this first contemplation, as you continue with it, right, you start to think, well, then if, in any given circumstance, what should I do today? What's going to make the most happiness for the largest number of people? I'll do that. It's not neglecting yourself, right? You're also a person, but it's saying, well, in other words, you're not interacting today with an infinite number of people, but you might be interacting with 15 or 20 people or 100 people or 5 people or 2 people, right? But if it's just you and one other person, well, you think, well, what's going to create the most happiness? Right? If there's something really meaningful that would create a ton of happiness for that person, then that's more important than a little bit of happiness for yourself, right? So that's just logical like that. So you get the idea that that's the first contemplation. And if you continue with that one long enough, right, because it's not, the first step, actually, I want to say, like the first, I'll go through a little bit of it. Like, the first thing is you have to understand the idea, right? So you'd have to like study a little bit and think, we're talking about it, right? And you think about it. So then you understand, oh, that's what the contemplation is, right? That's like what they call the wisdom arising from listening or study. That's just the first kind. Then comes the wisdom arising from contemplation. That means you have to think about it for yourself, right? Because you have to actually sit and meditate. That's what we started to do, right? But you have to do a lot of that. You'd have to keep saying, well, is that true? Is it really true that a cat wants it just as much as I do? Do insects count? Do they want happiness and not want suffering? How do insects act? You have to check for yourself, right? Like, is it true that people, like if you have certain, like prejudices, which actually everybody does, right? Then you have to analyze, well, is it true that the person I don't like, that they're exactly the same? Is that really true? Like, the person who has a political view that when they say it, I get mad, right? Is it true that in their heart they totally want happiness as much as I do? Right? You have to keep contemplating until your feelings change. Does that make sense? That's like contemplation, right? Because it's not enough just to say, oh yeah, everybody wants happiness, everybody doesn't want to suffer. That doesn't affect your feelings and your way of interacting with others, right? So you have to contemplate, and then once you contemplate for a while, and if you come to a conclusion, wow, that's really true. It's true of this person, this person, this person. I can think of all these examples, right? So that's what contemplation is. You bring up all different examples. You think of, that's why I started, right? You think of like people who are near the end of their life, people at the beginning of their life, people who are really angry. Do they want to be happy and not want to suffer, right? That should be contemplated deeply, of course, right? They're angry because they think they're not happy. But so you would contemplate over and over again using real examples from your own life. Does that make sense? You don't use examples from, you could read a Tibetan scripture or something, but you don't use examples from somebody else's life. You use examples from your life, right? And then you meditate on it, and that means that when you finally develop from your contemplation a feeling of equanimity, a feeling of even-mindedness, then you dwell in that. That's what the meditation part is you actually let your mind dwell in that feeling or experience until that your mind gets used to it. And actually, that's all meditation. The word gom in Tibetan, right, is familiarization. So meditation just means you're familiarizing yourself with a virtuous state of mind. And the virtuous state of mind in this case is equanimity, right? So for example, if you're angry and you're dwelling in hatred of somebody, right, then you're familiarizing your mind with something, but it's not virtuous, right? It's hatred. So that's not. We do that a lot, though, actually, right? Every time somebody makes us really mad, then we think about the fault of them, and then we get really mad, and then we sort of dwell on that feeling. That'd be like a wrong meditation, right? You're familiarizing your mind with the negative state. In this one, you use analysis, examples, experience, but reason, right? Until you come to a feeling of equanimity, and then you let your mind dwell in it. And if you do that enough, then eventually that becomes your new baseline of how you feel when you interact with others. So does that make sense? So when you've done that enough, right, until you actually feel a sense of equality as you walk around in daily life, then that'd be equalizing self and others. And that's just the first step in this method of generating bodhicitta. And I'll say what bodhicitta is in a minute, but so does that make sense, though, that would be the first step? So when you achieve that, right, then you walk around all day feeling empathic with others, right, and making your decisions about what would be the most happiness, what would make the most happiness for the most number of people, and so on. And they say that you can't realize bodhicitta if you don't first meditate on equanimity or equalizing. And both methods for generating bodhicitta have a contemplation. The one for the 7-point actually has a slightly different version of equanimity, but it's the same basic. The feeling is the same. It's It's a different way to generate that feeling, which we'll do another day, but the feeling is the same of this even-mindedness. I sometimes think like just that alone is very profound, right? If somebody actually realized that, where they walked around all day dwelling in empathy, but I want to be clear for bodhicitta, that's the preliminary. Does that make sense? So it's an absolutely necessary, but then you move on to other things. So I'm going to present two more points, and then we're going to have like a discussion about them. The next points are these, and these kind of, they're different points, but they go together, and you'll see how. One is they call it, some translators oftentimes say the faults of self-cherishing. I would call it, so I sometimes think, well, I think in English a reasonable way to call it is the faults of narcissism. That's another way, because the meaning of self-cherishing, that term in Tibetan, is not, isn't like, it doesn't mean, what's the word? Just to clarify, because the word self-cherishing can be confusing, it doesn't mean cherishing yourself in the sense of being kind to yourself. That's not the meaning of that. It means like putting yourself ahead of others. It means like cherishing an image about yourself rather than being in the moment. So it has all those connotations, and it means like sort of having a sense of self-importance, and sort of being preoccupied with thoughts and feelings and images about yourself rather than about others. Does that make sense? Or rather than so that sense of so that's what I mean by narcissism in a way. I sometimes think maybe a better way to I sometimes, if I don't want to call it narcissism, I call it self-image cherishing. I think that's a better way to think of it. Cherishing your self-image, which is different than like, recognizing you're tired and giving yourself a break. That's not what that's talking about. So it's not that kind of self-cherishing, right? If you've been working really hard and you say, oh, I need to rest today, that's not self-cherishing necessarily. Self-cherishing means that you have some idea about yourself and you're cherishing it. Does that make sense? So the idea here is that you contemplate, and I want to be clear, you don't contemplate other self-cherishing as a fault, right? That's not the meditation. Because that's easy to do. People do that a lot, right? This person's so selfish. That's not useful for sharing bodhicitta. The idea would be that you look at yourself, right? And you see, wow, first of all, do I cherish myself in an unhealthy way, right? Do I think do I act as though and feel as though I'm more important than others? Right? And the idea here, first you have to identify it, right? And then you have to see, are there faults to that? And Buddhism suggests, the Buddhist psychology suggests, is presenting a premise to you. That premise is this, is that self-cherishing which does exist in your heart is the cause of all suffering. That's Buddhist psychology's assertion. And that if you didn't have that, you wouldn't suffer. And that you suffer because you have it, you're not enlightened because you have it, you cause suffering to others because you have it, you cause suffering to yourself because you have it. And so that's a fairly radical, that's a fairly radical assertion, right? But so there's a contemplation, so you'd have to contemplate it, right? And I'm going to present this next one too. I'm going to go through them in more detail in a little while, but the next one that goes right after that, so you would actually contemplate, do I cherish myself in my heart too much, or not too much, in an unhealthy way, right? Whereas, is there this unhealthy state of mind in me, and does it cause my suffering and others' suffering? Right? And then the next contemplation is that cherishing others, which just means love, actually. Cherishing others in this sense means love. That love is the cause, so I'll call it love, that love is the cause of happiness. That loving kindness or compassion is the cause of all happiness. They sometimes say all happiness and samsara and nirvana. So all good things in this life, like even the good things in this life come from cherishing others, from kindness, from loving compassion. Good things in future lives, all the way up to nirvana itself, all come from cherishing others and from love and compassion. So one would have to contemplate those things. First of all, because the first thing is you have to understand, what are they saying, right? Then you have to contemplate and see, well, do I agree with that or not? Right? Is that true, or do I disagree? Do I think that that a sense of feeling that I'm more important than others is good, and that I want to do that even more, right? Or do I think that that's a true assertion, right? So you have to contemplate and analyze until you decide if you agree or disagree with that, right? And the idea here would be, and also do I agree that love and compassion are the causes of happiness? And so you have to, like I just want to be clear, in this method you would contemplate those points very deeply and repeatedly, over and over, looking at examples from your own life, examples from yourself, your own behavior, examples of the behavior and thoughts and feelings of people you know, right, your family, your friends, and so on, until you come to a definitive recognition of whether you agree or disagree, right? You have to be clear on it, 100% clear in yourself, until you eventually, this is where then, at the end of those two contemplations, if you agree, right? In other words, if you agree with the assertions and you contemplate them enough, then you reach a point where you don't just equalize self and others, you exchange self with others. And so that's the meaning of equalizing and exchanging self with others, is that eventually you reach a point where you say, well, from now on, I'm going to love others, I'm going to dedicate my entire existence to love and compassion for others. That and then comes this meditation on taking and giving, or tonglen, which some of you may know, which maybe we'll do today. And that's this method of generating bodhicitta. That's an overview of this method for generating bodhicitta. But so what I'd like to do before, I'll present some traditional Buddhist reasons, right? Because I just said what those 2 points are, right? The faults of, the traditional way, the faults of self-cherishing, the advantages of cherishing others. That's the traditional way of translating it if you look at them in most books. There are other ways that's translated, but that's the most common. But what I'd like to do first, before I present, sort of more on traditional Buddhist ways of analyzing that, is usually where we do this thing where people break up into groups and have a discussion or a debate or something like that. And this is a great one for that. So what I'd like to do is have you break up into groups, but not more than 4, so either 3 or 4 people. Should at least 3, but if you can have groups of 4, that's better. And try for groups of 4 actually. And what I'd like to ask is that whatever, or say this, half the group, or 2, let's say 2 people. I guess maybe we'll do, I think 3 is too few, so maybe we do groups of either 4 or 5. And so, so one half the group has to argue against that position, right? Says no, self-cherishing is important. Does that make sense? So part of the group, some people have to argue against it, saying, and actually that's not hard, right? You can take lots of examples from typical American culture says no, this is good, right? So that shouldn't be a difficult position to argue. Then the other people in the group argue for the side that self-cherishing does cause suffering. Does that make sense, what the idea here? And the purpose of this, I just want to be clear again, I've said this in other classes, but the purpose of this kind of discussion or debate is, one is it makes you think, right? But another is, whatever arguments the other person's saying, they're there in you on some level, right? In other words, that's the idea of debate. When the monks debate out in the courtyard, the idea is if you, that if you think long enough, anything someone else is going to say is somewhere is somewhere potentially in you. So it's a form of contemplation. Does that make sense? And sometimes it's easier to do it with other people, because if you just contemplate in yourself, you may not come up with as many creative ideas. But when there are 4 or 5 people discussing, somebody else's idea may spark something. So are there any questions about the debate part? Or is it pretty clear? Okay, so let's break up into groups of 4 or 5, split into 2 halves in each group, and then and I want to be clear though, if you're debating either position, whatever position you commit to, the rule is you stick with that position. So in other words, even if you feel like even if you don't like your position, or even if you feel like you're losing, you fight for that position no matter what. Does that make sense? Because that's the rules of debate. In other words, so even if you really think love is great, if you're on that side, you say no, love is not the cause of happiness. You got what I mean? And you have to make and argue that position faithfully. Does that make sense? And the same thing, if you believe in narcissism very strongly, and you take the other position, then really argue that position too. Okay? So go ahead and break up into groups, and let's do at least 15 minutes of that. I'll just say a few things about this kind of contemplation. Again, obviously, as would be the case with the equanimity side of things, you would have to contemplate again and again and again, right? In other words, because the goal here first is to come to an understanding intellectually, but then for that intellectual understanding, through contemplation to lead to some kind of experience, right? And then to meditate on that experience, right? So it would be a whole process that you'd have to go through. And I'll go through a few, like this is a subject that's, very huge in terms of the contemplations. But I'll just go through a few, just because I heard you guys cover some of these, but not all, and at least not in every group. So I'll go through a few. There are more, but I'll go through a few examples of the ways a person might contemplate. I'll start with the faults, right? The faults of self-cherishing or narcissism. Actually, one thing that sometimes I think Thomas Overmars says it sometimes. He says, actually, the faults of self-cherishing, you can't contemplate them all because they're infinite. Is what he says. So he says, it'd be impossible. In other words, you could spend an eon or something and you still wouldn't be done. Actually, but one beginning point that they sometimes use is extreme things, right? Like so, if you're actually sitting, because you'd be spending a lot of time thinking about this if you were using this method, right? So one thing you might start with is this: like murders, right? Do they come from loving kindness or do they come from self-cherishing? Theft, rapes, like what's that word? Like when somebody gets their stuff also stolen, like fraud and things like that, right? So you could go through examples like that, right? Where do those arise from? They arise from self-cherishing. In other words, in the mind of the person who's doing it at the time, clearly their thing of their own importance is infinitely more important than the other person's, right? If you murder somebody, you think you're, actually in a very foolish way, you're thinking that your well-being is so much more important than theirs. You can take their life and somehow that'll make you happy, and it doesn't work. But anyway, so you see what I'm getting at. And then so like if you look at like the most extreme problems, they come from that, right? Then also, like if you want to, this is just like one form of this contemplation, right? If you were to analyze where do like societal problems like war come from, right? So that like do wars usually arise due to extreme loving kindness or to some form of self-cherishing, right? So you would be analyzed, this is one level of analysis, right? You would start analyzing those things, right? And what that starts to do is to give a sense of aversion to self-cherishing. Actually, if you contemplate those things, right, like the extremity, right, because it's just more extreme version of what we have in our own. The idea here is though you have to contemplate mainly for yourself, right? So you say, I have a less extreme version in this moment of self, like my self-cherishing is not quite as out of control as the person who's murdering somebody right now, but qualitatively we're the same, right? I see my happiness is more important than others. The murderer sees his happiness is more important than others. Like, I'm not so different from a murderer, right? Or a rapist, or a thief, or all those things. So that's one level, right? The person who makes a war, right? Even like Lama Zopa Rinpoche points out sometimes, because the Buddhist view is that we have many past and future lives, right? So the idea would be this: is that if you don't get rid of self-cherishing in your heart, then eventually, if you don't become enlightened, eventually you will be, actually, right? Those things. You will be a murderer. You will be a thief. You will be a dictator. You will be. That's if you want to do past and future lives, that's one way of doing it, right? You would actually think, well, someday I'll be like them if I don't overcome this in myself. Actually, you don't even have to do that, though, right? Actually, if you actually really contemplate it deeply, I already am them, in some sense. In other words, if you actually analyze it, right? In other words, yes, whatever, yes, a dictator is more extreme in some way, but that's just because, they have self-cherishing and I have self-cherishing and they're in some circumstance where they have a lot of power and people are afraid of them and people don't want to give them feedback because they're too afraid, and so their self-cherishing gets out of control. Luckily, I'm not that rich and powerful, so people, if I start to act too grandiose, somebody will tell me off and, punch me in the nose or something. But if I were in a circumstance where nobody ever gave me feedback and, I was that way for 20 or 30 years, I'd be saying all sorts. So you actually contemplate. In other words, I'm not different from them even now, in some sense, unless I overcome my own self-cherishing. Does that make sense? So that's one way of contemplating. Another way of contemplation, so that you could do a whole long contemplation on that, right? Think of all the worst things that happen in the world and analyze, well, do they come from self-cherishing? Then also, even in the moment, right? Like in given moments, when I'm most happy, right? Am I cherishing myself or am I cherishing others? And you check. I mean, this is not like somebody saying, you've never been happy. You have to look inside yourself, right? But Buddhist psychology would say, if you analyze sincerely, you'll find that that when you're cherishing yourself in a way where you feel you're more important than others, and you're cherishing your self-image, and that there's an underlying fear, actually. If you analyze it psychologically, and this takes introspection, actually, but you would contemplate and see if this is true, right? But the idea would be this, would be that if I'm sort of holding on to a view that I'm more important than others, that some idea or image of myself is quite important, there's always insecurity there, right? Because then somebody else can come along and contradict my image of myself, right? If I say, I'm really wonderful person, and that's very important that that I understand that and others understand it, right? Well then, I'm very vulnerable because all I have to do is, just one person come along and say you're a jerk, and then I'm upset, right? My happiness is totally dependent on that, and then I'll be angry, right? And so you analyze and you see that, like, when you're in that mode of being, actually, there's always an insecurity in your heart because you're always trying to assert something about yourself to yourself, and then if you're interacting with others, you're trying to assert it to others, and so you're always trying to manage other people and control what's going on around you, but it's actually out of control. Bob Thurman, he says when you're cherishing yourself, it's you against the universe, and the universe is always going to win because it's a lot bigger. You know, in other words, you can't win, and ultimately you're going to die, right? So it's a losing battle to sort of say I'm something very solid and important, and we know that. The point here is that even in each moment we know that subconsciously, and so we're insecure. Right? Whereas, and actually Buddhism, I was actually just reading another book by Karen Armstrong, a scholar of religion, and it was touching that she was pointing out that this is not, the next point I was going to make is not unique to Buddhism. Actually she was pointing out that the great mystics of every religious tradition agree on this. She was pointing out examples of Christian, Jewish, Muslim, Hindu, each tradition examples that even in the moment that a transcendent happiness, an ecstasy, a joy comes from compassion. That's what she was saying, that was a universal insight. That she was giving examples of people from every religious tradition that experienced that. But Buddhism is saying that if you do that, right? Buddhism is saying the same thing those other people are saying in this sense, that if you actually practice compassion, you do experience a sense of ecstasy or transcendence or joy even in that very moment. Does that make sense? We'll get to later other things, but just in the moment, that's the path or the method to experience a sense of joy and ecstasy. There's Lama Zopa says a quote. He says, the moment you start to cherish others in your heart, happiness comes. Happiness arises in your heart. So that's not a behavioral thing, though, right? That's in your heart. So you have to check. In other words, and again, like just because Lama Zopa says that doesn't, that's just a point for contemplation. Then you check, right? So do you see if you're actually going to contemplate these things, right? Then you would have to say, well, I'll try it, right? I'll try cherishing others in my heart. It may take a long time to get to the point where I can actually feel a sense of that, right? And I'll see, does it lead to real happiness or joy? And if you try it, you cherish others, and you say, no, I feel miserable, well then, that's not, then you say, okay, I disagree with that, right? But if you try it and you start to feel more joy, well then, okay, you see, like, so this process is, let's see what we say, it's not just intellectual, it's also experiential. That makes sense, right? I'll just go a little further. Also, Buddhism says, the Buddhist teachings on karma, right? Karmic action. Like in terms of Buddhism, the Buddhist view is that karma is determined by your state of mind. Right? So if you give $1 million to a hospital and your motivation is self-cherishing, right? In other words, if your motivation is, I want everyone to know how generous I am, and I want my name on the front of the building, because then I'll be really important in town, like, the view would be that doesn't lead, first of all, in the moment that doesn't lead to happiness, because then you're like, well, that person didn't notice, they didn't say anything about like there's that feeling, right? Why didn't they say something? Didn't they notice? My name is really big up there. Or maybe they don't know who I am. Do you know who I am? Hi, I'm, and you stand under the sign and tell the person, maybe then they'll notice or whatever. But you see, like, in the moment there's that insecurity, and then Buddhism says also the result is only suffering, actually. In other words, even though you gave something, they say in that moment the result is suffering, and they say also karmically the result is only suffering. Whereas, according to Buddhism, it's the sincerity of your heart that makes something positive or negative. So all positive karmic actions, they say, are motivated by love and compassion. So something that leads to happiness in the moment is kind of influenced by love and compassion, Also something that leads to happiness in like karmically in the future is motivated by love and compassion. And then actually continuing on that theme, Buddhism asserts there are many verses like this in Buddhism, but one says infantile beings labor only for their own ends, while Buddhas work solely for the welfare of others. Understanding the distinctions between the failings of one and the advantages of the other, I will equalize and exchange myself with others. The point there is that they say that the difference between me and a fully enlightened Buddha is that I cherish myself, and the Buddha, at some point, was somebody like me who cherished themselves. The Buddha can be male or female. And there was the historical Buddha was Shakyamuni, who was, but Tara is a female Buddha, so it could be he or her. And Yeshe Sogyal was a female. There are many female Buddhas too. But the point is that the Buddha, in some previous time, was cherishing themselves and was going, therefore they remained in samsara. But then, what made them a Buddha was at some point they began cherishing others more than themselves, and that was when they began the Mahayana path. And so then they became a fully enlightened Buddha. So according to the Buddhist view, that's another way of contemplating. Is you look and you say, well, I'm still infantile and childish because I'm cherishing myself. But the moment I start to cherish others, I enter the path. Actually, I enter the Mahayana path. The moment I cherish others more than myself, it begins. Actually, that's when your process of becoming enlightened starts. So, and then all the qualities of an enlightened being arise from that. Actually, arise from cherishing others. Even the speed at which somebody becomes enlightened depends on the depth of their compassion. They say, they say, sometimes teaching that some Buddhas become enlightened actually very quickly in just one life or a few lives. Others take 3 eons. Others take 8 eons. Others can take 40 eons. Anyway, the point that they say is, what's the difference in the length of time is the depth of their compassion. Right? The ones who are more compassionate get enlightened faster. The ones who are less compassionate get enlightened slower. They still have compassion, right? But it's the depth and the power of their compassion determines the speed of their process of enlightenment. You guys mentioned this one, that also there's a whole contemplation of the kindness of others, right? And this one is that all of our happiness, I'm just going on with the contemplations, right? Another one is that all of our happiness depends on others, right? And if you hear His Holiness the Dalai Lama, wherever he goes, he talks about this one, right? That when you're born, actually when you're in the womb, you don't survive if somebody decides to have an abortion, then that life's over, right? If you're born, you totally are dependent on the life of the kindness of others, right? If somebody just leaves you somewhere, you'll be dead in how long, right? If you're a baby, very quickly, right? So your existence totally is dependent on the kindness of compassion of others and love of others, right? Even as you're a child, it's not just a baby, right? You're completely dependent, right? For your food, shelter, even like, food and shelter aren't enough, right? Some compassion, some touch, some children, they've done lots of research on that, right? Attachment research. That if children don't get some holding and some, so in other words, if you have a mind that's functioning enough that you're sitting here, that you didn't just get food and shelter, somebody held you, right? And somebody cuddled you enough so that your brain developed, right? Brains don't develop if children don't get a certain amount of holding, if somebody doesn't speak to them and just say something, whatever, Google Gaga, whatever, something, and then starts talking to them. That's how children's brains develop, right? So if you're here, whether you think that people were very kind to you or not kind enough, or you received still enough kindness that you developed, right? So that means you would have died if you hadn't received that, right? And then the Dalai Lama often points out, right, that at the end of life also, we're totally dependent on others, right? When we're dying, you can't say, oh, I'm a self-made person or something. And then in between, also, right, this is obvious, right, that our clothes, everything you're wearing comes from others. Most of what you eat comes from others. Even if you say, well, I grew it myself, the seeds probably came from somebody else, right? And so forth, right? And then your education, everything you learned, somebody taught you, right? So everything is dependent on the kindness of others, right? So we're interdependent. You see what I mean? So there are many ways to contemplate this. And so we could go through more, but I'll just say, so in brief, what you would do, right, for this kind of contemplation, if you were trying to generate bodhicitta, is you would think very extensively of all those reasons for the faults of self-cherishing, while looking at the self-cherishing in your own heart, right? until you felt, actually in the contemplation it says, eventually what happens is that you have an experience of saying, you could say disgust in a way, right? Like there was a revert, like just like, whoa, like I don't want to do that anymore. Like that's, in the same way, right? Like that. I sometimes think of it like this, like if you know somebody who's been an addict and succeeded in stopping using, right? Many people will tell you the story, like Alcoholics Anonymous kind of stories, right? Where the person was like, I know some people like that, like, they say, well, that they hurt like 5 or 6 different people they love over and over and over, and then humiliated themselves over and over and over, and finally reached a point where they said, I can't do this anymore, right? Like it's unbearable to continue living this way. The point is that you would have the same insight about yourself in terms of self-cherishing, right? You would say, it wouldn't just be intellectual, you would have an actual experience of, I can't do that anymore. Like it's too much suffering. I'm causing too much suffering to myself, I'm causing too much suffering to others. And it wouldn't just be intellectual, it would be experiential, right? Where you would feel, and there are many verses in different, from different bodhisattvas, like in India and Tibet, where you see them, like, what is it, one master, Dharma Rakshita, has a poem, he wrote what's it called, the weapon wheel mind training, the wheel of sharp weapons mind training, right? And he says, I don't know the exact words, but basically he says, he comes to this insight, he comes to that moment of recognition, and he says, now self-cherishing, I see you, right? He says, and he says, I see you, the enemy in my own heart, right? And he says, now I'm not going to stop fighting. He says, like, I'm finished with you, and now, no, he says, I hold a grudge against you, and you're not going to control me anymore. And he's like, wherever you go, I'll find you and destroy you. He's like that. And Tibetans, I've said this, but Tibetans tend to use the metaphor of demon. Indians, I find, more often use the metaphor of war. So they'll say, like, you're my enemy, I'm going to fight you. And Shantideva says that, right? He says a true warrior is somebody who fights the enemy. And Tibetans usually use the metaphor of demons, because the Tibetan culture has a lot of things, views like that. So they say the demon of self-cherishing in my own heart, right? I'm going to do an exorcism of myself. Not of some literal demon, but of my own self-cherishing.
Is there a danger to developing a strong element of self-loathing?
The key there would be that that's why I said earlier, you have to identify very carefully what is self-cherishing. Because yes, if you misunderstood what self-cherishing is, then that's possible. But if you understand what self-cherishing is, then what you're actually developing an aversion to is not yourself, it's an illusion, right? In other words, it's an illusory, it's an illusory false view of yourself that's caused you suffering. So it's actually, sometimes they say that actually developing aversion to self-cherishing is the ultimate form of self-love, in a way, right? Like,
Right.
in other words, now I'm going to be kind to myself, and I'm not going to do something that causes me suffering.
Yeah.
So you have to be, but if you misidentify what the problem is, then there's a danger of that. So you really have to be careful. That's why I said at the beginning, we have to be very careful to know what does it mean, self-cherishing. Because if you just thought, well, that's like taking care of myself, right? And I shouldn't take care of myself, and I'm terrible for taking care of, well, then you would end up with some crazy mixed up version of it.
And I guess that self-loathing could also be a form of self-cherishing, just the opposite end of the spectrum.
It is actually, yeah, right, yeah. Self-loathing is always a form of self-cherishing. It's an insane sort of mixed up version of it, right? But it's saying I'm so important. As soon as somebody says I'm the worst in the world, right? Well,
It's not possible.
It's impossible. So there's already what's the word? Say already there's an underlying. It's a mixed up version of it, but there's a sense of self-importance there,
Right.
And a sense of of unrealistic, deluded self-importance. That's the same as saying I'm the best. It's actually just as whether you're saying I'm the most important person in the world or I'm the worst person in the world is the same thing. Actually, they're both equally self-cherished.
Just like kind of picking up on what you just said, because sometimes I was wondering, it's like, sometimes it seems to me, just like logically, that it almost make more sense to just like go straight to just, like I read that stuff from like Ramana Maharshi and stuff, he's like Indian, I don't know if he was Buddhist or not, but like it almost makes more sense to just go straight to like meditating on selflessness, like as opposed, like it's, because it seems like if everything's coming from this like sense of self, like why not just spend all your time meditating on selflessness? Is there some kind of deficiency to that just like logically to me, like, because what you just said, it almost seems like that would be like the best way to do it.
Yeah, on the one hand, this method was taught, for example, by Nagarjuna, who taught selflessness in the
Yeah.
most profound way, and Shantideva, who taught it very, equally profoundly.
It's kind of the same thing, I guess, in a way, a little bit.
But there's a problem. I'll say what it is. Like, that if you don't do these contemplations, this is according to the Buddhist view of the path, right? According to the Nagarjuna school of meditation on selflessness, they do say this, that a practitioner of the middle school, in other words, the individual liberation, who only achieves liberation for himself and not enlightenment for all beings, that they generate a sense of love, actually, and they realize selflessness perfectly. In other words, somebody who generates the wish to achieve liberation from samsara does what you're describing, right? They meditate some on love, actually, but they emphasize meditation on selflessness, and they realize selflessness correctly. But because of the habit of self-cherishing from beginningless time in their heart, if they don't do these contemplations on the faults of self-cherishing, advantages of cherishing others, and actually exchanging self for others, if they don't actually realize that, then when they realize enlightenment, let's say, it's only an individual enlightenment, because the habit of self-cherishing is still there in them as a habitual pattern. They no longer believe in the truly existent self, but because of the energy that propelled them into that realization was motivated by a residual sense of habitual self-cherishing, and so they don't become a Buddha then, actually, at that time. They just achieve individual liberation, and they kind of dwell in some blissful realization that's genuine, but they don't help others. So in order to generate bodhicitta, right, and then what they say is that it takes bodhicitta is an incredible energy that involves cherishing others, that's what differentiates it, puts one into the Mahayana, or the great vehicle. So that would be the problem if you only, if you didn't do these other contemplations and you only went for meditation on selflessness, that then you wouldn't necessarily ever realize bodhicitta.
So you're not getting to the root of the self-cherishing mind?
Yeah, what happens is that you get rid of belief in a truly existent self, but it's a habit. Yeah, there's still the habit of cherishing yourself that isn't uprooted by that. That only can be uprooted by some method that gives rise to, because I'll differentiate also. Like according to the Buddhist view, I guess they would say this. It's actually interesting that they would say, I'm differentiating what individual liberation path and great vehicle Mahayana path. Right? They say that people on the individual vehicle path, right, just for their own liberation, actually do give rise to love, do give rise to compassion, then give rise to even great love that embraces all beings, actually. So they meditate and feel, I wish that all beings could be happy. They do that, actually, completely, they do that. What they don't do is because this is the path to bodhicitta, so it's actually, since we're talking about bodhicitta, it's an important distinction. As a person's trying to generate bodhicitta, they also do the same thing. So like somebody on the individual liberation path and a Mahayana person, both will reach a point where they feel experientially, may all beings be happy. That's same. But the difference is this, is that a person on the Mahayana path at a certain point says, abandon self-cherishing enough so that they actually generate a feeling of, I myself take responsibility to stay, like the Dalai Lama says, right, for as long as space endures, for as long as sentient beings remain, I too will remain, to dispel the misery of the world, right? That's the Dalai Lama's favorite quote, they say. That's uniquely a Mahayana. In other words, so it goes beyond just great love to a point where a person actually experientially feels a sense of, they call it sometimes universal responsibility, right? Where the person feels, they say, it's like the difference between, I'll give an analogy here. It's the difference between like if you see a child suffering on TV and you feel compassion for them, right? And then you change the channel, right? That's different from if you're that child's parent, right? If you're that child's parent, then it's not, you don't turn the channel, and even if the show ends, you don't stop thinking about it, right? Like you say, I'm gonna go and free them from that. That the Mahayana attitude is like the parent, but towards everybody. And that's why it says, for as long as space remains, for as long as there are sentient beings who are suffering, I will remain to dispel the misery. It's a sense of responsibility like a parent, but you feel that towards everybody. You feel like everybody's mom. Actually, you know, so does that make sense that that's a different thing, and that doesn't, you don't get that realization of actually cherishing others like their mother does, everybody, just for meditating on selflessness. You have to meditate on one of these two methods to realize bodhicitta, or else it doesn't. You may realize love, you may realize compassion, but you won't realize that unique attitude of, cherishing others more than you cherish yourself, actually, right? Because that's why I'm using the analogy of a mother. Like, there is not all mothers feel that, but many do, actually, right? Like, where somebody, they actually, like sometimes like, I was just with my sister who has a baby, two young children. I saw, like, she totally cherishes them more than herself. Whereas in that moment, I would watch her in the moment, like I would see, she would rather do this, but they want that, and she would, without any hesitation, she did that, right? Like, and that's, like, so there's this attitude, in that case, it's cherishing, those two people, right? Those two little creatures, more than themselves. But in the Mahayana experience, right, when the person is about to this is before you, is when you become, there's a unique cutoff point to enter the Mahayana, and that's when you have that kind of feeling towards all beings. Does that make sense? So that's different than great love. That's different than, in other words, it's dependent on universal love. It's dependent on universal compassion, but it's another step. Does that make sense? And these are like, actually, it's interesting, right? The process of developing bodhicitta, since that's what we're talking about today, right? First comes a sense of equality, right? Now, I'll use the word Hinayana, right? Hinayana practitioners also realize equality, right? But you have to realize that first. Then, the faults of self-cherishing, the advantage of cherishing others, what that leads to is an experience of universal love, actually, right? And then eventually it leads to what's called the exchange of self for others, right? So at the point where you exchange self for others, that's when you enter something that's Mahayana, right? Because you're cherishing others more than yourself and feeling like a mother towards all beings. I'm choosing that as a metaphor. So that only happens through specific contemplation on these kinds of points. Does that make sense? That wouldn't happen otherwise. And then, actually, I should continue. I'll just continue. So if you're actually, are there more questions, or did I answer your question?
Are they parallel? Like, are these things happening parallel, or are you supposed to like realize one thing and then move on to the next thing? Like,
you mean like equanimity, then?
Yeah, or even just like bodhicitta, and then you go on to like emptiness, or like or whatever before like an effect. Sometimes with like the Lamrim stuff, I get a little bit confused. I'm like, because like, it's like, wow, like I don't know if I'll ever realize bodhicitta like that.
With those 2 points, actually, what they say is that on that point of emptiness and bodhicitta, they say that it depends. Actually, that they've actually said there are bodhisattvas who realize there are bodhisattvas who have done both. Some realized bodhicitta first, then realized calm abiding, and then realized emptiness and so on. But then they say there are others who, I think Nagarjuna was one of these, who realized, like, he had meditated on equalizing and exchanging self for others for years, they say, but he hadn't fully realized bodhicitta, so he was doing both in parallel, actually. They say that he realized emptiness, and because he had been training so much in this method of equalizing and exchanging self for others, when he realized emptiness, like, that put him over the top in terms of his ability to realize bodhicitta, because because he understood even more deeply the faults of self-cherishing at that point, right? Because he had been contemplating so much on the faults of self-cherishing, and then when he realized emptiness, he saw that what he had been cherishing was illusory anyway, and that helped him to realize bodhicitta. So it can happen in either order, actually.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Good question. Well, something we were talking about. If you want to, say you're somebody. Their compassion would be to provide them with, they're an alcoholic and they want, something to drink, or they're a drug addict and they want drugs, and, that's what's going to make them happy, okay, at least in their mind. And that giving that to them is, you're going to say no,
Right.
okay, but isn't that you, like, putting yourself above them, or better, or, your knowledge and understanding, you're like, you're self-cherishing yourself, so to speak. I know better than you do, so I'm not gonna provide this for you, okay? You know, where do you draw the line between compassion and enablement?
The idea, I'll say a couple of things about it. One is, two things. One is one thing that's very important is to understand, is that compassion is a state of mind, not a behavior, right? So in other words, compassion, so if you feel compassion for somebody, that doesn't necessarily imply any specific, that you'll do any specific behavior in relation to that person. That's the first thing, right? Like, so because compassion means, actually compassion in Buddhist psychology is defined as with a feeling of warmth and connection towards another person. So first, there's a preliminary to compassion is you feel warmly and affectionately towards them, and then you wish for them to be free from suffering. Does that make sense? That's the experience of compassion. That's the way Buddhist psychology defines the experience of compassion. So then, so it's an important point that doesn't imply any specific course of action, right? So a person could be feeling compassion and then could equally, you can't tell. They might give somebody something, they might yell at somebody, they might, scold somebody, they might praise them, they might hug them, they might ignore them, right? It would depend on what, for example, like, I'll give an example, like, what's there to say? There are times where the most compassionate thing would be to do nothing. Right? Like, there are moments where if I do something, it'll make it worse. So out of compassion, I do nothing, So that's the first thing. So compassion is a state of mind. So the behavior depends then on the circumstances. And then in Buddhism, actually, what they say is that this is an important point. That at each level of the path, you get. In other words, as you get more enlightened, right? At each level of the path, you gain more wisdom about how to help others, and so actually. So that the decision of what to do based on your, right, so the first thing is, do you have compassion? That's, but then the decision of how do I enact this compassion then depends on your level of wisdom. And, and so I think that there has to be a sense of, I'll say my own, now this is more my own view on that then, is that there has to be some sense of humility that, in other words, I'm using my best wisdom. I don't know ultimately, like if what's, like for example, like the alcoholic who comes for a drink, right? Like, so I have to use my best wisdom, because, so I probably would say no, but I don't, what if I, like somebody who's maybe, I don't know, somebody who could seem more dependent, maybe that would have been the drink that they would have been there, they would have gotten drunk and realized that was the last, I'm done with this, and that was the last drink, and they never would have drank again. I don't know that, right? So you have to use the best wisdom you have, and this was a relief to me one time. Somebody asked Lama Zobrumshe a question like that, and he was saying, like, he was going through all the different levels of the path, because there are 5 paths and 10 bhumis, and he was saying, so like if you're on the 7th or 8th bhumi or something like that, right, which is this incredible level of realization where you can, I don't know, shoot bodies out in your dreams to visit, all different things, that they still make mistakes, like, because they don't have perfect wisdom yet. Like, there is that when they're trying to help others, they have incredible wisdom and they have incredible compassion. They've realized great compassion and universal compassion, all these things, like long before that. But because their wisdom isn't perfect, they try their best with their best wisdom to help others, and occasionally, compared to a Buddha, they do something wrong, because they don't know everything about all the causes and conditions and circumstances of somebody else's history and life and potential and all those things. So I think there has to be some sense of humility that, in other words, I have to use my best wisdom in this moment to do what I think, the best I can do for whoever I feel compassion for, whether that's giving them something or not giving them something or saying something or not saying something, but knowing I could be wrong, and what they say is that that's one of the reasons to continue, well actually, maybe that's a great lead-in, so I'll say this, so actually, because what's bodhicitta then? Now I never really said, at the beginning I said I would say what's bodhicitta, right? So now that's a good lead-in to the final point, or this other point. So bodhicitta actually, right, which the bodhi is the same root as bud for Buddha, right? So bodhi and Buddha have the same root, which means awake, right? A person who's awake or enlightened. Sometimes they translate enlightened, right? But I think literally it meant awake is probably the most accurate, but has the same connotation as enlightened. And then chitta is mind, in Sanskrit. So what it means though is not, it means the mind, the awakening mind. That's a good translation of that. But so the definition of that, according to Maitreya, is that based on, right, compassion and universal responsibility that I was talking about, that the person generates the wish to achieve full enlightenment in order to benefit all sentient beings. So it's so there's two parts to it, right? One is the compassionate wish to benefit all sentient beings, but then the other part is the wish to achieve enlightenment for that. So in other words, if a person hasn't yet, so there's two, right? So you have to generate, first you have to generate this sense of universal compassion and universal responsibility, I'll call it, right? The sense of feeling like a parent to all sentient beings, or feeling, you know, that you cherish them, feeling that you cherish them the way you used to cherish yourself, you know, that you have that level of commitment to others. But then there comes a moment where the person realizes, kind of like you were saying, the person has this recognition, right? So the person's been meditating and they get that experience, actually, where they really experientially feel universal responsibility. And then they recognize, there are different ways that bodhisattvas have described this as they're practicing the path, but basically something like, well, now I want to take responsibility for all sentient beings' happiness, but I can't even successfully, I've not yet even achieved my own nirvana. I can't even, like, I'm not even perfectly happy myself. How can I achieve, you know, how can I help others? I don't have the wisdom to be able to actually effectively, I can do something, you know, at any given level we can do something. So it's not that I can't do anything for others, but my ability is very limited. And so the person says, I have to become enlightened. I have to become a Buddha. I have to become a fully enlightened being so that I perfect all the qualities that I can perfect. In other words, that I become as wise as, you know, as wise can be, right? And as compassionate as compassion can be, as skillful can be. That I have to become that so that I can most effectively help others, right? That's the best way to help others. And by the way, my own welfare will be achieved too, just by a side effect of that. And so that's when the person sets out to enlightenment, right? And actually that's when they really begin the Mahayana path. In other words, that's when the moment a person realizes bodhicitta, right? They say, I'm setting out on that path to achieve enlightenment for the benefit of all sentient beings. But so you see all these preliminary steps that the person has to first realize equanimity, have realized, you know, love, compassion, you know, infinite love and compassion, then the sense of universal responsibility, and then they can realize bodhicitta, right? And then they set out because they want to be more effective. That's all, right? Like, whereas they recognize I'll be the most. How, you know, in other words, if I, and actually this is interesting. I'll just share this. That then what bodhisattva. This is why it takes longer to achieve. You know, somebody who's achieving individual liberation, it takes shorter time usually than to achieve full enlightenment. And the reason is, right, that when a bodhisattva practices the path to enlightenment, they learn all the paths actually. Like, so they actually practice. You know, if somebody wants to just achieve their own liberation, how do they do that? And they go through those practices up to the level where they could almost achieve it, and they go back. You know, they say, I don't want to achieve that though, right? They go up this path, they go up that. You know, they actually learn how to get out of every kind of problem, in a sense, right? Experience. So it's not just some intellectual knowledge, but they actually like enter into all kinds of problems in order to understand how do you get out of them, right? So they become a perfectly skillful teacher. So they say that's part of the reason why the Buddha took 3 countless great eons to become a Buddha, was that, like, you know, he could have achieved his own liberation much more quickly, but they say, what's the word to say it, that he did that, and also he had to go relate to beings and establish connections with, you know, because his vow was to benefit others, right? So he had to also, like, they call it creating your own Buddha field, or creating your own Buddha universe or something. They had to go out and also find people who were confused and suffering and develop relationships with them, be their parent, be their child, be their king, be their subject, be their husband, be their wife, be their pet, be their slave, and he developed a relationality with all of them, just helping them, right? He gave his life to some people, he gave teachings to other people, and he developed these relationships, and then you see when he became a Buddha, there are all these stories where somebody says, you know, somebody will come along and like they'll interact with him for one day and they'll achieve their own liberation. And then his disciples say, how'd that happen? Who was that person? And he'll say, oh, I met them, 4 million years ago, and I started then leading them to the path, and so I brought all the conditions together so that now they could do this or something. So anyways, this is a whole process bodhisattvas go through then to not just achieve their own enlightenment, but in some sense to create the connections so that they can lead others to enlightenment also. Does that make sense? So it takes longer than it does to become an individual liberated being, because they're doing it out of great compassion, so they want to do it for others. That makes sense. Actually, I want to clarify one other thing too, though. So in this method of equalizing and exchanging self for others, right? So I just want to go through the steps again, right? So you got equanimity, that's clear, at least what it is, right? How you would meditate on it. Then the faults of self-cherishing, the advantages of love and cherishing others. Then exchanging self for others, where you actually make that decision, right? You say, okay, now I'm going to exchange myself for others. And then there's a very skillful method called tonglen, or taking and giving. And that's that, we don't have time to go through the whole thing, but I just want to describe it because it's a really important method. So what happens, that comes, in other words, technically in Mahayana practice, if you were going through this, this comes after all those other contemplations. Sometimes it's taught just in and of itself because it's such a beautiful meditation practice. But this would, so you can do it anytime, but this would be the point where bodhisattva, where if you were training, you would emphasize it. And that's that practice where you imaginally take on the suffering of others. So you actually, the whole practice is you imagine self-cherishing as a dark seed in your own heart. Right? Then you think of the suffering of others, right? And you can do it in meditation, or you can do it when you're walking around, like with people. But you actually imagine you imagine where you look at it. You don't have to just imagine it, you can go out and see it, right? And so either way, the suffering of others. But then what you imagine is that through the force of your compassion, you imagine taking their suffering away from them, like a dark cloud, or a pollution cloud. You imagine drawing it to you, which is the sense of compassion that you want to take it away, right? Again, and you can see how that's compassion, right? You really want to take it away. So it's a visualization to it that gets at the feeling, right? So you imagine their suffering rising up like this pollution cloud from them, and then with this feeling of compassion, you imagine taking it from them. So that's taking, right? Taking and giving. And you actually imagine taking it into your self. Right? Sometimes you can do it just visualize like you're taking it into yourself. Sometimes they do it through the breath, where you imagine breathing it in. Either way is acceptable. And then you imagine it imploding upon and destroying the seed of self-cherishing in your own heart. And the psychological meaning there, right, is that self-cherishing is the cause of suffering, right? We already contemplated that. So you say, well, let the other suffering destroy that self-cherishing. Does that make sense? And then you imagine that the self-cherishing seed disappears. So it kind of implodes, and then it disappears. It's actually, it's okay for it to just disappear because the self that you were cherishing, that version of the self wasn't real anyway. So it's okay for it to disappear, right? It wasn't something that actually truly existed. And then you do giving. So with giving, what you imagine then is that in the place of where that dark seed was is like a brilliant light, like the sun, in your heart. That's love. Right? So that's just a symbol of love. Right? And you imagine then radiating out whatever beings need in accordance with your own wisdom, right? Whatever you can imagine that beings need. And so that's where, if you read some of the prayers of Shantideva, they're quite beautiful, right? Where he says, where people need a bridge, may I be a bridge. Where people need a teacher, may I be a teacher. Where they need a doctor and a nurse, may I be their doctor and nurse, may I be their, that's his meditation like this, right? That's love meditation, right? So that's giving. So you actually imagine giving out, and you imagine sort of giving others whatever, everything they need until they achieve enlightenment. So you imagine, and then you repeat that process. You imagine taking on the suffering of others, giving away happiness, taking on the suffering. So you just keep doing that over and over, and what that does, if you've already done the other contemplations, you can see how that reinforces the entire, right? All those other contemplations that we just talked about, this reinforces them. And also, what they say is that this is actually a very true point, is that also it's a meditation on bravery, actually, right? That because there's a habit, that we have because of self-cherishing, right, that we've been habituated to for so long, we have a habit of wanting to turn away from others' suffering, and of not wanting to engage, right? And not want, and a fear, actually, of that, right? And what that kind of taking and giving meditation does, is it overcomes that habit of fear, and it brings about greater bravery. So if you do that over and over again, that kind of meditation, then naturally, what a result of that is that you're less afraid of your own suffering and of others' suffering, right? So if you're suffering, you're not so afraid of it because you feel, well, everybody suffers. And it's just like, I'm with others in this. And you actually, so like somebody who practices that, then when, because things happen in life, right? When something hard comes along to them, they just think, okay, well, I'm suffering from this pain. Everybody suffers from this pain. May others' pain ripen on me too. May I give them all happiness. May others' pain ripen on me too. May I give them, right? So, you know, you see, bodhisattvas, even when, when they get cancer, that's their thought, right? When Lama Zopa Rinpoche, when he had the stroke, they said that was one of his, he said, that was, he thought, oh, may all beings have stroke, may everyone have strokes, may they all ripen on me, may everybody else be free from strokes, right? Like, while having a stroke or something. Geshe Lama Kunjuk, while he was falling down, they said once, while he was still falling down the stairs, he was thinking, may everybody, I think he said, may any obstacles to Lama Zopa's long life ripen on me as he's bouncing. Like, but there's a feeling of, I guess what I'm getting at there is there's a feeling of bravery of not turning away. You don't turn away from your own suffering, and you don't turn away from others' suffering. That's from Tonglen. Does that make sense? And you become brave in actually being able then to do the bodhisattva's deeds and to practice and to realize bodhicitta and all that. But also, I'll just say, so Tonglen is an incredible, actually, it's, there's no better meditation really than Tonglen. That makes sense, right? These other ones, the pyramid, you have to do these others to be able to do Tonglen well. You have to understand the faults of self-cherishing, the advantages of love and compassion, and then experience them some. But then Tonglen is the best, because you can do that also all day, right? Wherever you go, you can do Tonglen, because luckily there are always people around who are suffering. So it's easy to do in daily life, right? And especially if you, like in Washington, it's a great place to do Tonglen. This whole area is really good, because people are stressed out, so it's really good. And then you see how, also, if you're practicing Tonglen, even in life, right? Other things you might have to go on retreat, right? But Tonglen, you can be in retreat and do it, but you can also be in the busiest place, like a metro stop is a great place. You'd have to ask, is it better to do Tonglen in retreat or in a metro station? A metro station is at least as good, right? And if you get sick and in your hospital, it's an excellent place to do Tonglen, right? But also if you're healthy and and out walking around, it's an excellent place to do Tonglen, right? Wherever you go is a good place to do Tonglen, because wherever you go, there are people suffering, right? And if you're alone, they're still suffering, so you can do it alone too. So Tonglen's amazing. It's really, and they say, so Tonglen will be the one right before, in this method, you would do Tonglen until you realize bodhicitta, actually. Does that make sense? Okay. Well, we just got a minute. So I wanted to say, so this is one whole method, right? And that's sufficient. So actually, so you could just do that practice over and over, and eventually that's the way many bodhisattvas realized bodhicitta, just by contemplating that way for long enough, or something, until they transformed inside. Okay, so I just want to say about a few things about the class then before we stop. So first of all, people who are anybody can attend these classes, right? But then some people are taking them for completion certificate or something. The ones who are taking it to complete it, these are the the forms you have to fill out, to hand in, to show that you did all the meditations and all the reading and stuff like that. So if you didn't get one before of these and you're taking it that way, I'm going to put them here and just come up and take one at the end. I want to say a couple more things about this though. So since this is the last class here in this series, right? Because now we start in a couple weeks or something. In 3 weeks, I think, we start the next module, which is how to meditate. So we'll go through the details of posture and of different kinds of meditation, and actually all the real mechanics to do it professionally, to do it just right. So we'll do that. That's the next thing. But about presenting the path, I just want to clarify a couple things. So one is a requirement for this class is the 3 to 6 day Lam Rim retreat, right? So that's what's next weekend: Friday night, Saturday, Sunday. So that's going to count as 3 days. We're not going to do 3 full days because people work on Friday, so we're being, that's okay, it's flexible. So people who want to do that, we're doing it in Manassas, right? So anybody's welcome to come also. You don't have to be taking it for completion certificate, anybody's welcome. And what we're going to do is we'll meditate on all these different things that we covered. I want to clarify a couple things. One is, during that retreat, we'll do some Tonglen practice, right? So you got a chance to actually experience that together. Another is, there's one meditation I didn't cover yet that's required for this class. I'm going to cover it there, and it's meditation on emptiness. We did talk about it, but we didn't actually meditate on it, and we'll do that there. So we will do a meditation on emptiness during the retreat. For the retreat, also just for people who are doing it for the completion certificate, by then you should have memorized your one Lam Rim prayer. Remember that we emailed out 2 of them? So you should have memorized it by then, so we'll have a little quiz or something. And I'll also do, I'll be clear, we'll do something to kind of make sure everybody processed everything. It's not going to be difficult with that, but we'll do mostly meditation. And also, in that retreat, I want to do, so we'll mainly meditate on these points that we've been covering, right? Like the faults of samsara, the nature of craving that we all, remember we went through a whole bunch of stuff on that. We'll meditate a bunch on that. We'll go through actually all these meditations in Tonglen. We'll meditate some on emptiness, on refuge, so, different things like that. And also I want to do, we'll do a brief, not a brief, we'll do it, in the retreats, it's hard to do the interactive discussion exercises, but we're going to do one in this one. In the last retreat, it was a little, we didn't do that because it was on like Vajrasattva and stuff, so it wasn't really, didn't fit. But in this one, we will do an interactive exercise, and it'll be around applying Lamrim to daily life in a certain way. So I wrote up a little exercise on it. We'll do it during the retreat too. So that's that about that, and then, like I said, so then I think it's in about 3 weeks, if I remember right, that we start here, how to meditate. And that's the next module. So here we have how to meditate, and then after that, relating to the spiritual teacher, I think is what it's called. So we'll do those 2 modules next. Any questions before we start? Okay. Well, actually, before we start, let's just do, the last thing we should do, just very briefly, is to, we always try to do this at the end, right? Is to dedicate any positive energy, any virtue, any good karma that we've created. Dedicated, particularly since we were meditating on bodhicitta today, discussing bodhicitta. So we can dedicate it so that, like, this discussion, right, any positive energy, any merit, any goodness that came from it, through that, may each of us here be able to actually actualize, right, the realizations of equanimity, love, compassion, exchanging self with others, Tonglen, bodhicitta, and through that we will be able to practice the path of the bodhisattva in order to be of the ultimate benefit to others. Also, may everyone, right, may all beings dedicate this energy, that all beings may be free from suffering, may achieve the happiness that they want, and even may they achieve like happiness they can't imagine. So if they can't yet imagine, all of us, there's levels of happiness we can't imagine. So may everybody be able to achieve, be free from even the most subtle, from the grossest sufferings down to the most subtle. May everybody be able to achieve every kind of happiness up to the greatest happinesses, the levels of bliss, enlightenment. May everyone realize compassion and love for each other, so there be no war, no hatred, no prejudice, so that everyone cherishes each other rather than harming each other, so that everyone is naturally not hurtful and violent to each other. So through this energy, may we help make the world more like that.